What if the weapon a country spent 30 years perfecting could be undone in a single afternoon by a boat with nobody driving it? That's not a hypothetical anymore. It's happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz, and almost nobody is talking about what it really means. Before we go further, hit that like button right now. Not for me, but for every sailor whose life just got a little safer because a machine is doing the dangerous part instead of a human being. Subscribe if you want to understand how wars are actually being fought in 2026, not how movies pretend they are. And if you've got a friend who still thinks naval power is about who has the biggest ship, send them this video, because that idea is dying in real time. Let's rewind and understand what Iran actually built, because none of what's happening now makes sense without it. Iran never had the money or the shipyards to build aircraft carriers or a fleet of destroyers that could go toe-to-toe with the United States Navy. Everyone in Tehran knew that. So instead of trying to outbuild a superpower, Iran built something cheaper, sneakier, and, in its own way, genuinely clever. It's often called the mosquito fleet. Picture dozens, sometimes over 100, small fiberglass and composite hull boats. Some carry rockets, some carry torpedoes. Some are simply packed with explosives and turned into floating bombs. These boats hide in narrow coves behind small islands and inside rocky inlets along the Iranian coastline, places too shallow and too cluttered for big warships to patrol easily. The plan was simple and brutal. The moment a target shows up, dozens of these boats race toward it from every direction at once. Think about what that does to the crew of a warship standing watch at 2 in the morning. Radar can track many targets. Weapons systems can engage several threats. But when 50 or 100 small boats appear from every bearing at the same time, the problem stops being about firepower. It becomes about attention. You cannot watch everywhere at once, and one boat only needs to get close one single time to change everything. This is called an asymmetric strategy. And Iran didn't just build it, they rehearsed it constantly, for decades, often in full view of satellites, boats weaving in tight formations, broadcast to the world as a warning. Come into these waters, and you will pay a price. This wasn't empty posturing either. There is a long, well-documented history of Iranian fast boats closing dangerously on American ships in real encounters, not drills, forcing sailors to sound warning horns just to keep them at bay. And the program kept evolving. Faster boats, better missiles, homegrown radar and coordination networks so the swarm didn't depend on anything that could be jammed. This was Iran's answer to the entire United States Navy, built around numbers, speed, and patience, instead of steel and size. So, when tensions boiled over into open conflict earlier this year, Iran didn't hesitate. They followed the plan they had rehearsed for 20 years. Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on Earth, a route that normally carries well over 100 ships a day, carrying a massive share of the world's oil. And they backed that closure with everything they had. Mines seated along the seafloor, boats ready to swarm anything that moved, missile sites tucked into mountains along the coast as a long-range backup plan. Insurers pulled coverage, shipping companies rerouted or simply stopped. For a moment, it looked like Iran's 20-year gamble was finally paying off, right in front of the entire world. But something happened that Iran's own playbook never accounted for. The United States didn't respond the way that doctrine assumed it would. Here is the real insight behind everything that followed. Iran's entire swarm strategy was built around exploiting one specific weakness: the limits of a human crew. Limited eyes, limited attention, the fear that creeps in when danger comes from every direction at once. The smartest way to beat that strategy was never to throw more expensive, more vulnerable human-crewed ships into that same trap. The smartest way was to remove the human bottleneck completely and replace it with something that doesn't panic, doesn't blink, doesn't need sleep, and is cheap enough that losing one barely matters. That is exactly the direction the United States Navy had been quietly building toward for years, largely away from headlines. And on July 12, 2026, that quiet development turned into something historic. United States Central Command sent 3 unmanned surface vessels, small uncrewed attack boats built by a company called Saronic, toward Iran's Bandar Abbas naval base, right near the entrance to the strait. These boats, called Corsairs, approached the port on their own, slow, quiet, and completely uncontested, because nobody expected an attack to come from an empty boat with no crew aboard. Video released afterward showed the strike hitting a submarine maintenance facility, with what looked like a small Iranian submarine suspended on a repair gantry right at the point of impact. It was, according to the Pentagon's own statement, the first time American forces had ever used sea drones in actual combat. Let that sink in for a second. No sailors were put in harm's way. No pilot risked ejecting over hostile water. A machine did what used to require a warship, a crew, and enormous risk. If you're starting to see how big a shift this really is, drop a quick comment telling me one word for what surprised you most so far. because I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. Now, that single strike wasn't happening in isolation. It was one piece of a much bigger picture. And understanding the full picture is what actually explains why Iran's swarm doctrine started running into serious trouble. Around the same time, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, aiming to choke off the trade that funds the regime's military programs. According to American officials, that blockade has been costing Iran roughly $500 million a day, with dozens of vessels intercepted and several ships seized outright. That is not a small number. That is real, sustained economic pressure layered directly on top of military pressure, and it changes the calculation for how long Iran can keep replacing boats, missiles, and mines that get destroyed or seized. At the same time, American and allied forces went after the other legs of Iran's strategy too. Reports throughout this campaign describe strikes against Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait, an effort to physically remove the invisible threat sitting on the seafloor before it could ever be triggered. And alongside the unmanned boats, more conventional air power stayed heavily involved. Aircraft built specifically to hunt small, fast-moving targets at low altitude. Exactly the kind of platform that struggles to be fooled by a boat trying to hide behind a wave or duck into a rocky inlet. None of this happened as one dramatic knockout blow. It happened as layer after layer, applied at the same time, against a doctrine that had never been tested this seriously before. Here's the part that makes this genuinely fascinating instead of just another headline. This capability didn't appear out of nowhere the moment the crisis started. The Navy had been developing unmanned surface vessels for years, running experiments, testing designs, working through failures most people never heard about. Just weeks after that historic strike on Bandar Abbas, the Navy carried out its first live-fire exercise with a different class of unmanned boat, called the Global Autonomous Reconnaissance Craft, sinking 2 decommissioned American warships during a major Pacific exercise to prove the concept works at scale. This wasn't a rushed, panicked reaction to a crisis. It was years of patient engineering finally getting validated in the real world under real pressure against a real, determined opponent. Think carefully about what this actually changes strategically. Iran's entire swarm doctrine was never designed to sink an aircraft carrier through sheer numbers. Nobody in Tehran seriously believed 100 small boats could defeat the United States Navy outright. The real purpose was cost imposition. Make any attempt to challenge Iranian control of the strait expensive, chaotic, and risky enough that nobody wants to try. That kind of strategy works brilliantly, right up until the moment your opponent decides the cost of dismantling it is finally worth paying, and shows up with tools built specifically to remove the human vulnerability the entire plan depended on. Now let's be completely honest with you, because a story like this deserves the full picture, not just the flattering half of it. Iran did not simply roll over and accept defeat. This conflict has been messier and more back and forth than a single triumphant headline suggests. In April 2026, Iranian fast boats swarmed and seized 2 container ships near the strait, a clear signal that the so-called mosquito fleet was still very much operational, even after months of American pressure. Iran has also leaned harder into deception, using explosive-laden drone boats disguised as ordinary wooden fishing vessels, blending directly into legitimate maritime traffic. In March 2026, maritime authorities confirmed that a Marshall Islands flagged oil tanker was struck by one of these unmanned Iranian boats north of Muscat, with the crew forced to evacuate. That is a genuinely difficult problem to solve, because now every small fishing boat on the water becomes a question mark, instead of something you can simply ignore. If you've made it this far, that tells me you actually want the real, complicated version of this story, not just the highlight reel. So go ahead and share this with someone who only ever hears the simplified version of what's happening in the Gulf, because they deserve the nuance too. So here is the honest, deeper analysis, and it's more interesting than a simple win or lose narrative. What's actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now isn't a finished story where one side has clearly and permanently beaten the other. It's an arms race, playing out in real time between 2 very different philosophies of war. Iran is betting on cheap, disposable, deniable weapons that exploit the fact that you can never be 100% certain which small boat is a fisherman and which one is a bomb. The United States is betting on persistent, tireless, networked machines that can watch, track, and eventually strike without ever putting a human life at direct risk in that first moment of contact. Both sides are adapting to each other constantly. Every time Iran disguises a boat more convincingly, it forces American and allied forces to widen what they treat as a credible threat. Every time American forces get better at spotting the disguise, it makes Iran's next attempt a little less effective and a little more expensive to pull off again. But here is the deeper truth sitting underneath all of that back and forth, and it's the part that should genuinely worry anyone still betting everything on a swarm-based strategy going forward. Iran's entire doctrine, going back decades, was built around exploiting human limitations. Slow reaction times, a limited number of eyes, The fear that creeps in when a crew realizes danger is closing in from every direction with no clear way to track it all. That kind of strategy only works for as long as your opponent keeps sending human beings into that exact same trap, over and over again. The moment machines start doing the watching and eventually the striking too, that entire foundation stops making the same kind of sense. A machine doesn't panic when 50 contacts appear on radar simultaneously. It doesn't need a shift change at 3 in the morning. It doesn't hesitate for half a second longer than it should out of pure human fear. And once you start removing that human bottleneck from one layer of the fight after another, the whole logic behind an overwhelming swarm attack starts to lose its power, piece by piece. This moment matters far beyond just one strait and one conflict. It's a genuine preview of where naval warfare is heading everywhere. For most of history, the ocean rewarded whoever had the biggest ship, the thickest armor, and the heaviest gun. Increasingly, it's starting to reward whoever has the most patience, the most persistent surveillance, and the smartest network of unmanned eyes quietly watching the water day and night, never needing rest, never losing focus. Iran built its entire naval identity around a weakness that modern militaries are actively working to remove from the equation. And as that weakness gets chipped away piece by piece, the advantage Iran spent 20 years carefully building starts to erode along with it, even if the fight itself is far from finished. It's also worth being clear-eyed about the cost side of this equation, because that's often the part people overlook. Every disguised boat Iran loses is a boat they cannot easily replace, especially with sanctions restricting access to the specialized parts these systems need. And every successful American or Allied detection of a disguised threat makes the next disguise attempt a little less effective, because the surveillance network learns from it. That is a genuinely difficult arms race for the side that has to keep manufacturing cheap, disposable boats against an opponent whose detection systems keep quietly improving with every single encounter. Meanwhile, the blockade keeps draining resources Iran would otherwise spend rebuilding its fleet, tightening the pressure from an entirely different direction at the exact same time. None of this means Iran's swarm tactics have vanished completely, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Small, fast, hard-to-detect boats will likely remain a genuine threat in the Strait of Hormuz for a long time, especially disguised ones blending into ordinary fishing traffic. But something fundamental has shifted, and it's not going to shift back. The idea that a swarm of small boats could reliably overwhelm human attention and force a superpower to simply avoid a stretch of water, that specific assumption just took a direct hit it can never fully recover from. Once an adversary proves that unmanned boats can strike a hardened naval facility and hit a submarine without risking a single sailor, the entire cost calculation of controlling a contested waterway changes permanently. So, what does all of this really tell us, once you step back from the day-to-day headlines and look at the bigger shape of it? It tells us that the age of hiding inside chaos and human limitation is ending, not because of one dramatic silver bullet weapon, but because of years of patient engineering finally proving itself under real pressure in a real conflict, against a real adaptive enemy. It tells us that the next great naval powers won't necessarily be the ones with the biggest fleets, but the ones with the most patient, most persistent, most tireless network of machines quietly watching water that never stops moving. And it tells us something almost unsettling if you sit with it long enough. Somewhere off the coast of Iran right now, a small boat with nobody aboard is still out there, watching, waiting, feeding information back into a network that never sleeps and never looks away. It doesn't feel fear. It doesn't need courage. It just keeps watching, patiently, for exactly the moment it's needed again. And that quiet, tireless patience might end up reshaping the rules of naval warfare far more permanently than any single missile or any single ship ever could. If this changed how you think about what's really happening on the water right now, that's exactly why this channel exists, and I'll see you in the next one.